really serious about, and that's our theme, and we've been covering some different topics. You know, is Jesus really serious about ... Is he really serious about church? Is he really serious about forgiveness, about the times we live in, about the storms we face? And as we go on, we will unpack some of these themes, but I want you to think about, as you're journeying with God, is Jesus really serious about? And we need to think about our place within God's commission, his mission, and our lives, and having him as a part of our lives. And so we'll be unpacking that, and it's a rhetorical question, as I've said, is Jesus really serious about? And for us to ask ourselves, because sometimes it's too easy to be casual about our relationship with God and just be a little dismissive and say, yes, I believe. Just a little bit more than that. All right, so today we'll be looking at, is Jesus really serious about loving one another? Do you know the last time I preached a sermon on something like this was back in 2003? Do you know why it's been so long? Because when I talked about that at the time, there was an audible groan in the church. Oh, not another sermon on loving one another. Oh, why is that? Because it's too hard. It's too hard. It's much easier just to know the doctrines. That's far easier. State of the dead. Let's do that one. Oh yes, I can fill in the blanks on the questions. That's far easier. But to love one another, too squishy. Anyway, we're going to have another look at this, and hopefully we will be able to pick up on something that will help us with that. But first of all, I want to just show you a little video clip on a moment whereby someone had, just before you press play, when someone proposes to someone, do you remember the day that you proposed to your husband or to your wife? Or I don't know if you remember who did what or which way around it went. Do you remember that day? Well, here's, it's a real highlight for people. This is what happened to this couple, if you just want to press play. Is it going to work? We may not. If not,
Disneyland Paris apologized after an employee interrupted a marriage proposal at the amusement park. The video posted on Reddit shows a man dressed in white kneeling to make the proposition of life, and suddenly a park employee with Mickey ears rushes to the stage and snatches the ring from the man's hands, then scurries down the stairs, urging the couple to go down. The baffled couple looks at the man before following him. The viral clip was originally posted by Redditor Waskatlan, who said he knew the man in the video. Disney said the park apologized to the couple for the outage.
Yes, that's great, but over here she's going to be even better.
well, wouldn't that ruin the moment? And it did. People are all the time looking for love, and that romantic love, that romantic moment that you would sort of cherish, and this couple had all organised to do that on that particular stage. And you sort of think, oh, it ruined it. people today are looking for that kind of romantic love, but that's often fleeting. But what does love actually look like? And so the best place to look at that would be in the Corinthian church. But before we look at the Corinthian church, we'll just take you to the ruins there of what is left of Corinth. But it sits here. You may not be aware of where Corinth sits, but there's in the top left-hand corner, that's a map of Greece there. And so we're just looking at this little wee square here, and there's a narrow bit of land there, and there's the Gulf of Corinth there to the north, and the Saronic Gulf to the south. And the south is effectively here, the southern part of Greece there. And this part here, this very narrow piece of here in Corinth, is a very narrow piece of land there that's only about 9k wide, and it's called the isthmus. So if you've got a lisp, you're in trouble. So, but it's Greek for a neck, and Corinth itself, that's the isthmus there. And they've dug a canal there, which they finally completed around about 1893. But prior to that, they've always envisaged that there must be some way we can make a canal there. So back in 7th century BC, one of the Romans says, right, we're going to get a whole lot of slaves here and start digging. But they realised that it was just too much work, to dig that kind of canal. And so what they thought of was, we want a canal or some way of getting to the other side, because it's a long way around the bottom. You see what I mean? So what they came up with was, we'll get the boats and we'll start to drag them along a road. And so they'll get the boats up out of the water, and they would put them on rollers and take them that short distance along to the other side. A lot of work, isn't it? And so that's kind of what it would have looked like, taking a boat across. Panama Canal didn't think of that, did they? So anyway, that's one way of doing it. So this is what it looks like today, and boats were able to go through the isthmus, and but unfortunately, it's that one side of it has collapsed and it's all blocked up, and boats still used to use it up until that point in time. So now the ruins of the Corinth. So you've seen where Corinth is. It's right on that neck. Now Corinth has had a patchy history over the years, and it was destroyed around 146 BC by the Roman emperors. And then it was rebuilt 100 years later by Julius Caesar, who saw an awful lot of potential in Corinth because of its location. And so here's what the ruins of the city of Corinth looked like back then. This was the temple of Apollo, one of the religions there, and this is the fountain of Parin. And if you were to drink from this fountain, you'll get the wisdom of Pegasus. So was the rumour. And this is the temple of Octavia. He was one of the emperors there, and you might recall that the Roman emperors were into the worship of themselves, and he was very much into the worship of himself. Very humble man indeed. So that's the remains of the temple of Octavia, and you'll recognise those figures there of the sun worship, and the Statue of Liberty there in the middle, and the sun god that they worship. Now, There's some of the statues that have been preserved from there. This is Emperor Augustus. That's what he looks like, and you'll recognise this person here. Yeah, well, that's Nero. That was, yeah. You didn't recognise him? Oh, I don't know. I don't know how they picked him up. But this bloke here, he's a fascinating character from Corinth. And he's called Diogenes. He lived around about the 4th century. And he's called Diogenes the Cynic. He discovered the philosophy of cynicism. Make a good Australian. But he lived in a barrel, and he discovered his own cult, but he was an interesting character from that time. But at the time of the Corinth, there was a Jewish presence there, and this is, that there translates to, in case you're not aware, synagogue. And there you can see the Jewish symbols there, and a passage there that you can see today. For the slight momentary affliction, Paul says, is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond comparison. Now, the city of Corinth, fascinating place. Remember I said to you it was destroyed in 146 BC, and then they decided to rebuild it again. Now, it was completely obliterated. So, Julius Caesar started from scratch because he saw huge potential because of location, location, location. This had the potential to be the trade route of trade around the Mediterranean, and that's what it became. And the city flourished and boomed very quickly to become one of the largest and most densely populated cities in the Mediterranean. It was able to trade in wheat from Sardinia, papyrus from Egypt, incense from the Middle East, and carpets from, just everything. And everything went through Corinth. And so that isthmus became really quite important in terms of trade, because if you came in from the north, you could just take your little boat over to the other side, and then you can go into the Saronic Gulf or vice versa. And so what kind of people are you going to get who's going to settle into Corinth when it starts from scratch? What a good question. You're going to get a whole lot of multicultural people who are going to settle there. So you've got people from all over the Mediterranean. You've got no tradition. You've got no, if you've got 100,000 people with no tradition who've come from all over the Mediterranean, they come there for one reason: money, to make it. So you've got the entrepreneurial spirit there. So all these people are descending on here. They're going to make a living, a huge living. And to help things along, there's another place right next door to Corinth that's called Acrocorinth, which means above Corinth. And what's above Corinth is a fascinating place, is a city that's built on a rock. And very hard to see, but you can just make out up here, there's a whole lot of preserved. These are some of the most well-preserved ruins from the time of Christianity that are around, and you'll see why. Look at that. That comes from the 1st century, and this is Acrocorinth. And the purpose of this is that when you have a city that is invaded, Acrocorinth was the place where people would go for refuge, because as you could see from that would be an incredibly difficult place in order to invade. And so people go through the gates there, go up. So you can see how well fortified this place is. And people were protected and incredibly difficult to invade. And that's a nice view from it there. Now, also, just as a little bit of a sidebar, Corinth was actually destroyed in 521 BC. Now, what did they do with all the gold and the brass gold? And it's interesting where it all ended up. And actually, they melted it all down and they took it to this place here in Rome. And in Rome, this place here is called the Pantheon. That was built just a little bit after Corinth was destroyed, and they used it on the roof. But then they thought, no, we don't want it on the roof anymore. Let's take it to St. Peter's Basilica and put it on there. So the gold and the brass and that all came from the city of Corinth. So recycling, they did it all back then. Isn't that good? So anyway, that was just a little bit of a sidebar. So when you have a city that was, what was the characteristics of the city? It was multicultural, entrepreneurial. So people came there to make it. It also had no tradition, and their religion was, and I mentioned to you about Corinth, up there was the temple of Aphrodite. Now, what would happen every night was that 1,000 prostitutes from the temple of Aphrodite would descend onto Corinth. So you can imagine what kind of city Corinth was. You get the idea? Anything goes. Anything goes. And so when we look in Acts chapter 18, if we look in Acts chapter 18, Acts chapter 18. And we'll read verses 8 to 9. Somewhere here. Here we go. The leader of the synagogue believed that the Lord with all his household, and many of the Corinthians, when they heard, were believing and being baptized. And the Lord said to Paul in the night by a vision, "Do not be afraid any longer, but go on speaking and do not be silent, for I am with you, and no man will attack you in order to harm you, for I have many people in the city." Could you imagine in a city like that, evangelising a city like that? Could you imagine what the church would be like? Fascinating, isn't it, to imagine? You know, and just to sort of add, just to tack on a little bit here, the difficulty in evangelising the Corinthian church is no more difficult than what it is today. It's very difficult today. It would have been very difficult back then. But the mission of God still was going forward. Even though we sit back and we sort of think, oh, it's so hard today. And it is. No question. Secularism presents different frontiers for us to surmount. But you imagine how difficult in a city whereby anything goes. You got the entrepreneurial spirit here, and you would imagine, and I would imagine, that for Paul, it would have been difficult to share the gospel. However, God's Spirit was pulled out, people repented and joined the Christian church. But what was this church like? Let's go to 1 Corinthians chapter 12, and we'll read the very last verse, because we're going to delve into 1 Corinthians 13. And, 1 Corinthians 13, as you know, is the love chapter, and we only reserve that for weddings. But I can assure you, it's not just for weddings. It's actually for the Corinthians and also for us. So anyway, Paul, at the very end of chapter 12, gives a segue into chapter 13. Verse 31, but earnestly desire the greater gifts, and I will show you a still more excellent way. And how people back in the Old Testament would have understood that I will show you a more excellent way. You remember during the Exodus, whereby, how were the people led? By a pillar of fire. And so as God was leading them, very similar phraseology and very similar language that was to recall them back to that. And so Paul is saying, as God led the people through the Exodus, through that time, I am going to show you as a church a more excellent way that comes from God himself. And that's when he starts to go into the words that we know so well. So let's just have it rip into 1 Corinthians chapter 13. If I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, but do not have love, I have become a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy, and if I know all the mysteries and all the knowledge, and if I have all the faith and so as to remove mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing. If I give all my possessions to feed the poor, and if I surrender my body to be buried, but do not have love, it profits nothing. And then he says, love is patient, love is kind, and is not jealous. Love does not brag, and is not arrogant, does not act unbecomely. It does not seek its own. It is not provoked, and it does not take into account a wrong suffered. Now, where does Paul get this list from? This is what was happening in the church. Just reverse it a little bit. They weren't kind to one another. They were jealous of one another. They were bragging about themselves. They were arrogant. Just come over, just for instance, over to 1 Corinthians 4 verse 6. Just go back a few pages. 4 verse 6. Now these things, brethren, I have figuratively applied to myself and Apollos for your sake, so that in us you may learn not to exceed what is written, so that one of you will become arrogant in behalf of one another. Some of your versions might say puffed up. And so Paul, he in the previous chapters, he was looking at the various characteristics, the way that they behaved in the church, the way that women behaved in the church, the way that worship services were conducted, the way that the rich were treating those who didn't have anything. That was the Lord's Supper. Those who were fat and greedy were eating all the food themselves and they weren't sharing it. So the Lord's Supper was a mess. The worship service itself was disorderly. The people themselves were arrogant. What's it like dealing with an arrogant person? They're full of pride. What's it like dealing with an arrogant person? Is it easy chatting to them? Is it easy talking to them? They like to do the talking. They like to go flat, 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 flat. I know it all. I'm not going to listen to you. How can you teach when one is arrogant? Paul mentions arrogance a number of times in Corinthians. He mentions it. And so the people themselves were arrogant. Now, they were also a gifted people. They were very gifted. They were talented. And I need you to just hold on to those couple of words, because they will become really quite important as this chapter sort of unfolds just that wee bit more. So let's go back to verse 1 again. And he says here, if I speak with tongues of men and of angels but do not have love. Now, as Adventists, we get bogged down on this one, and what questions do we ask ourselves? What is the language of angels? Guess what it is? No one knows. No one knows. Well, there's speculations, this, that. And guess what? It doesn't matter. Okay? Because that detracts from the main point. And the main point here that Paul was going to slam home to them was that if you spoke in the language of angels and if you don't have love, what does that count for? Guess what else it doesn't count for? Well, Paul goes on. If I have the gift of prophecy and I know all the mysteries and all the knowledge, here's a good Adventist here. He knows all of Daniel 7, 8, 9, and he can recite from memory Daniel chapter 11. And if he's a good Adventist, he might even be able to identify Donald Trump. Right. Okay, if I have the gift of prophecy and know all mysteries and if I have all the faith, so as to remove mountains but do not have love, I want you to think about that for a minute. This is really quite sobering. It really is. Because they had the gift of prophecy. What would they be thinking? That I am okay. I am all right. I have the gift of faith. I can move mountains. Therefore, I am okay. You getting the idea? But what Paul is saying, no, you're not okay. You might be able to speak in the language of angels, but if you don't have love, you're not okay. And if I give all my possessions to feed the poor, and if I surrender my body to be burned but do not have love, it profits me nothing. Now, the word burned, some of your versions might have boasting. Does anyone have boasting? It should be boasting, because the burning of Christians didn't actually begin to occur a wee bit after that. So otherwise that would have been more pertinent. But the word should be boasting, and there's only one Greek letter that differentiates boasting and burning. So I get that the two are very different, but contextually, boasting sort of fits in with the genre of the chapter so far to the point. So, you know, if one is boasting, I've done this and I've done that, I've given possessions to the poor, what this reminds me of, you remember the rich young ruler. You remember, have you kept the commandments? And at that point, he was feeling, good about himself. I've done all that. Yes, eternal life, here we come. But then he heard that horrible word, but. Terrible. There's just this one thing. What did Jesus say to him? Go and sell everything and give it to the poor. Oh, that's deflating. He went away very sad. But let's just look at that verse in that context of the rich young ruler. What would happen, therefore, if he did go and sell everything that he had? Would that guarantee him automatic passage into heaven? No, because if you did that and sold all your possessions, and if you do not have love, it counts for nothing. Wow, this is staggering stuff. Let's come over to Matthew 7. Let's go to Matthew 7. And this is a passage I know that you know very well. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father is in heaven will enter. But many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not what? Prophesy in your name, cast out demons in your name, perform many miracles in your name. And then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Now, you remember when Jesus sent out the disciples? And it's recorded, I think, in Mark 11 or Matthew 11, whereby he sends all 12 out. They were to cast out demons. They were to perform miracles. God gave them the Spirit to do that, and that was what happened, including Judas. Including Judas. Balaam prophesied. But he also said he wanted to do right. But he kept on wanting to pronounce curses on Israel. And even a donkey tried to pull him up on it. Balaam had the gift of prophecy, but he was still trying to curse Israel. Odd, isn't it? Saul, King Saul, had the gift of prophecy. He also prophesied. But things ended pretty badly for him, didn't it, by the time he went to the witch of Endor? What am I saying here? These people who had tremendous gifts, you had Saul, Balaam, Judas, would have experienced and seen the effects of healing, but there was something missing. The Corinthian church had the gift of prophecy, but there was something missing. Here's the thing. When they would have had the gift of prophecy, casting out demons, doing all these wonderful things, and when I say that the Corinthian church were entrepreneurial, they were gifted, they were arrogant, they thought, yeah, I'm right, I'm all okay, and therefore I am okay with God. Because I have the gift of prophecy, because I have the gift of teaching, I have the gift of entrepreneurial, the gift of making money, therefore God has blessed me. Do you see what I'm saying? But they did not have love. So Paul is trying to say to the Corinthian church, despite your talents and your gifts, you don't have that. Yeah, it counts for nothing. You don't have the gift of love. You see, the Corinthian church was a bunch of rabble, weren't they? Multicultural, entrepreneurial, and do what they like, when they like, how they like. Very sensual. To bring a church like that together is a testament of the gospel, is it not? Truly is. But they did not have the gift of love. But they had other gifts, and it was because of those other gifts they thought that they were okay. I am all right. But Paul says you are arrogant, you're puffed up. You need to have that gift of love. It's a miracle that you come together. It's a miracle that you have those gifts. But here's the greater miracle. What's the greater miracle? The ability to be able to love one another. That is the greater miracle. And that can only come from above. You can't manufacture it, can you? That is the true miracle, because all the others you can put down as talents. Yeah, they were talented people. But here's the bigger miracle. Look, I can stand up here today and you can say, Mark's not a bad bloke. What do we think of Mark? He's all right. I can get up and preach. But if I go out that door and my soul is twisted with anger, bitterness, jealousy, unkindness, horrible speech, terrible thoughts, what's wrong with that? You don't know, do you? You can bury all that inside. But Paul is saying, love is patient, love is kind. The greater miracle here is the miracle of love that needs to and must do imbue and change and transform our souls and transform our church. That's what must happen. And that can only happen by a miracle of God. I can tell you that our church, I'm speaking generally here, when we look at NCD results, the biggest challenge that we have is loving one another in our church. You can go to a lot of churches around Australia and there's bitterness. People don't talk to each other. Don't talk to him because he or she is like this or that or done this, done that. Oh, don't talk to that person because that's what they did 20 years ago. Oh, really? Let it go. Love one another. How can we rise above that? You might have Mr. over here and Mrs. over here. At some point, Mr. and Mrs. need to move on and get over their bitterness. There might be people here whom you don't like or dislike. Do you know the most courageous thing that we can do is to walk across the room and to make up, to talk things out? We have no problem in talking to those whom we like. But the greater miracle is to show kindness and patience and to love one another. That is the miracle. Lord, help me. And when it comes to the practical side of things, we have to ask God to help me to love other people whom I don't like. Now, I've got tombstones in my backyard, as we probably all do, of relationships, friendships or whatever it is, that are no longer operating for whatever reason. But if you lie in your private moment and bitterness rises up, what do you do with that? Take it to the Lord. Lord, I still have these thoughts. Take them away from me. I still have this anger toward that person. Pray for that person. Lay it on the altar. Lord, help me to like that person and not to hold anything against that person. And Lord, help me to touch someone whom I don't know, and help me to talk to a person and to share with a person whom I don't know. One of the great things about Rosny is that it's able to reach out and talk to other people whom are not members of our church. That needs to continue. And if we're not good at talking to other people, ask the Lord to help me to talk to other people, to reach out. If you have anger and bitterness that is still imprisoning you, lay it on the altar and ask for the miracle of God's love to change our hearts. And that's what it means by lives transformed by Christ, by connecting with Him. And that is the only way that can happen. And so Paul here, as we sort of go back to 1 Corinthians, and I just want to just read those words again in 1 Corinthians 13 of what Paul was inspiring them to do. If I speak with tongues of men and of angels, but do not have love, I become a noisy gong and a clanging cymbal. These things speak for themselves. If I have the gift of prophecy and know all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have faith so as to remove mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing. And if I give all my possessions and feed the poor, and if I surrender my body to be burned, but do not have love, it profits me nothing. Love is patient. Love is kind. It is not jealous. Love does not brag. It is not arrogant. Does not act unbecomingly. It does not seek its own. It is not provoked. Does not take into account wrong suffered. Does not rejoice in unrighteousness, but rejoices with truth. And so Paul goes on. These are slices of what love looks like. How's that going in our walk with God? It's never going to happen perfectly. We expect it to happen perfectly with others. But it's never going to happen perfectly. But with the honest intention that we keep on treading forward, we ask God to help us, give us wisdom in difficult situations and in difficult relationships. Ask God to help to heal. Ask God to give me the right words to say. And we all need that kind of love. And I'll just, even in the animal kingdom, animals want love. And here's an unlikely couple. A goose and a little pup. And that pup was abandoned by the mother. And somehow the goose saw the need of the pup. And quite literally, the goose took the pup under its wing. Isn't that amazing? That is the miracle. That is the miracle. And God wants that miracle of love to happen in each of our lives. We all want to receive love. Have no problem with that. But we need to learn to give love. And that's what the Corinthian church battled with. Incredibly talented, gifted people. But you saw how difficult it was for Paul to raise up a church in that city, that very sensuous city. But the thing that they needed to have was that gift and that miracle of love. And that is the same for us today. Learn to give love. Turn to Him and He'll perform that miracle. Our final hymn today is, Lord, I want to be a Christian in my heart. And as we sing that, reflect on what we have talked about today.